Today's video is sponsored by Shortform. You don't have time to read every book ever written, and that's where Shortform comes in. You guys can get a 5-day trial to their time-saving book guides. More on them in a bit. We've talked a lot about the ancient empires that were centered thousands of years ago in that cradle of civilization known as Mesopotamia. We've talked about the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and today we're going to take a look at the Assyrians. Specifically, we're going to examine the life of Ashurbanipal, arguably the greatest king of Assyria. He held dominion over the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which in his time was the most far-reaching empire in history, while its capital, Nineveh, was probably the largest, richest, and most magnificent city in the ancient world. Ashurbanipal is best remembered for his royal library, which had amassed a gigantic collection unlike any before it, thanks to the king's zealous hoarding of texts. But make no mistake, Ashurbanipal was a ruthless and bloodthirsty warmonger, one the likes of whom the world had seldom seen up to that point. He transformed his mighty Assyrian army into a war machine that mercilessly stomped his enemies into submission. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Elamites, the Cimmerians, the Arabs, they all faced the wrath of Ashurbanipal. Born circa 685 BC, Ashurbanipal was the son of Esarhaddon, king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and one of his royal wives, perhaps Ashara-Hamat, the only one whose name we know. Ashurbanipal was part of the Sargonid dynasty of Assyria, which ended up being the empire's last dynasty before its complete collapse, but also represented Assyria at the height of its power. Between approximately 2000 BC and 500 BC, Mesopotamia was dominated by two cultures, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who ostensibly took turns in being the regional hegemon. Ashurbanipal's great-grandfather, Sargon II, founded the Sargonid dynasty by usurping the throne from his predecessor in 722 BC and ushering in one final golden age for Assyria. He was succeeded by Sennacherib in 705 BC, who grew his empire's power even further and unleashed utter destruction on his kingdom's archenemy, Babylon, leaving the city in ruins following a brutal siege and sacking. However, his biggest contribution was moving his empire's capital to the city of Nineveh and undertaking massive construction projects to transform it into the envy of the ancient world. After him came Ashurbanipal's father, Esarhaddon, in 681 BC. Even though he was Sennacherib's son, he distanced himself from his father, both in texts and in actions. He considered that it would be better to appease the Babylonians rather than rule them through fear and violence, so one of his most ambitious projects was to rebuild what Sennacherib had destroyed. Esarhaddon restored all of Babylon's important buildings and structures, and even took part in religious ceremonies honoring the Babylonian gods such as Marduk. That being said, Esarhaddon wasn't completely peaceful, and although he showed a lot of favor to Babylon, that did not extend to other vassal states such as Sidon and Urartu, which tried to rebel before being once again dominated by the Assyrian army. Esarhaddon also attacked new lands, most notable of all being Egypt, which he conquered in 671 BC. The Assyrian drove out the reigning pharaoh and became the first Mesopotamian ruler to give himself the title King of Egypt. Esarhaddon had a large family, and Ashurbanipal was probably his fourth eldest son. Nobody expected him to ascend to the throne, which is why he most likely trained as a scribe or a priest when he was young. However, Esarhaddon had been a sickly man throughout his life, and so were many of his children. His eldest son and crown prince died unexpectedly around 672 BC, so Esarhaddon was left with the task of deciding which offspring would become the new ruler. He decided that there should be two kings, the king of Assyria and the king of Babylon. Although the two were technically equal, everybody knew that the king of Assyria was the true ruler who governs the whole empire. For whatever reason, Esarhaddon dismissed his third son as a candidate. Scholars speculate that this was because the boy was already in poor health, so it was assumed that he wouldn't live very long. That left the king with his second and fourth oldest sons, Shamash, Shum-Ukin, and Ashurbanipal. Again, we don't know what reasoning Esarhaddon had, but he named Ashurbanipal as his true successor, while the older brother was given the lesser the title of King of Babylon. Afterwards, he had all of his vassals recognize Ashurbanipal as his legitimate heir by issuing a decree called the Loyalty Treaty of Nakia Zakutu, named after Ashurbanipal's grandmother. This came in handy because Esarhaddon did not have a lot of time left. Even though the king was already in poor health, he marched to fight the Egyptians in 669 BC, who were rebelling against Assyrian rule. He died on the way, but the steps that he took previously ensured that the transition of power went smoothly, and each son accepted his new role, at least for now. In 668 BC, Ashurbanipal became the ruler of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the largest and most powerful empire that the world had ever seen up to that point. His priority was to finish what his father had started and bring Egypt back under his dominion. The conquest of Egypt was not an easy one. Esarhaddon's first attempt had been repelled, and even when he had been successful in sacking Thebes in 671 BC, he was unable to capture the pharaoh Taharqa or Takhara, who fled to Kush. Now Taharqa was back, and with reinforcements, and after occupying Memphis, he forced all the local officials to recognize him as Pharaoh of Egypt again. Therefore, in 667 BC, Ashurbanipal marched on Egypt to crush the rebellion once and for all. Fortunately for us, Ashurbanipal was an incredibly thorough record keeper. Archaeologists have recovered numerous tablets, cylinders, reliefs, and other artifacts that were commissioned in his time and detail his exploits. All of his successes, at least. He wasn't as diligent when it came to preserving his failures for posterity. Anyway, one of these artifacts is known as the Rassam Cylinder, and it gives a long, first-hand account of most of his military campaigns, so we might as well find out how it happened from the king of Assyria himself. He said, "In my first campaign I marched against Taharqa, king of Egypt and Ethiopia, whom Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, the father who begot me, had defeated, and whose land he brought under his sway. This same Taharqa forgot the might of Ashur, Ishtar, and the other great gods, my lords, and put his trust upon his own power. He turned against the kings and regrets whom my own father had appointed in Egypt. He entered and took residence in Memphis, the city which my own father had conquered and incorporated into Assyrian territory. At these deeds, my heart became enraged, my soul cried out. I raised my hands in prayer to Assur and the Assyrian Ishtar. I mustered my mighty forces which Assur and Ishtar had placed in my hands. Against Egypt and Ethiopia, I directed the march. In the course of my march, 22 kings of the seacoast, of the midst of the sea, and of the mainland, servants subject to me, brought their rich presents before me and kissed my feet. Those kings, together with their forces, on their ships by sea, on the dry land with my armies, I caused to take path and road. Taharqa, king of Egypt and Ethiopia, heard of the advance of my army in Memphis and mustered his fighting men against me, offering armed resistance in battle. With the help of the great gods, my lords, who advanced at my side, I defeated his army in a battle on the open plain. Taharqa heard of the defeat of his armies while in Memphis. The terrible splendor of Assur and Ishtar overcame him, and he went mad. The glory of my majesty, with which the gods of heaven and earth have crowned me, overpowered him. He forsook Memphis and fled to save his life to Thebes. That city I seized. I had my troops enter and occupy it. Ashurbanipal could be pretty cruel even by ancient standards, as evidenced by the fate of the cities that plotted against him. And the people of Sais, Peniti, Snu, and the rest of the cities, as many as had joined with them in plotting evil, they struck down with the sword, both great and small. Not a man among them escaped. Their corpses they hung on stakes. They stripped off their skins and covered the city walls with them. As for Taharqa, he fled once again and died in 664 BC. Ashurbanipal then installed Necho I as the new ruler under his vassalage and went home, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't the end, because Taharqa had appointed a successor named Tantamani or Tanwetamani, and he also tried to retake Egypt, prompting a second campaign from the Assyrians that very same year. Ashurbanipal was once again successful, and this time his actions were more drastic and definitive, ending the sack of Thebes in 663 BC, a momentous event that is even mentioned several times in the Bible. He effectively ended the Nubian line of pharaohs and returned to Nineveh rich in plundering, including silver, gold, precious stones, and all the wealth of the palace, rich cloth, precious linen, great horses, supervising men and women, 2 obelisks of splendid electrum weighing 2,500 talents. Now we'll continue with today's story in just a moment, but first a word from a brand new sponsor, short form. If you like my channels, then you probably like learning stuff. A lot of you guys like to expose yourself to new ideas or new information by reading, which is great. But the last 2 decades have seen an exponential rise in the amount of content that's available for consumption, from YouTube content like this very video you're watching right now to articles, podcasts, and of course traditional books. If you're like me, you probably feel that there's never enough time in the day to consume everything that you think is interesting. That's where short form comes in. They hijack the central themes and need-to-know ideas from hundreds of books, making them easily available to you in consumable packages. And this can be really convenient too. For instance, you know there's a massive 500-page tome that you've been thinking about reading, but you're not sure if it's something you want to invest all of your free time in. Pop into short form, check out the summary, and you'll have a much better idea of whether or not it's worth your time. Short form is also a great tool for books you've already read. Listen to their guides once a book is complete, and it can give you additional insight into some of the major motifs, or maybe you read something a long time ago and you want a little refresher. Either way, it won't be long before you're walking around with the confidence of an English lit major. If you want a recommendation today, I'd recommend Prisoners of Geography, 10 maps that explain everything about the world. I don't want to spoil anything, it's an absolute must-read. Do go check it out on short form. Right now, you guys can get a free unlimited short form trial for 5 days, plus a discounted annual subscription. Just go to shortform.com/biographics to check it out. There's a link below. And back to today's video. Despite his triumph in Egypt, Ashurbanipal's influence over the region began decreasing almost immediately, and this time the king did little to stop this. Part of the reason why was because Egypt was at the outskirts of his empire, so from a logistical standpoint, it was a lot of effort to march his army there from Nineveh. Another reason was that Ashurbanipal had other revolts, enemies, and projects to deal with, so he did not want to dedicate all of his time and energy towards Egypt. Inside Assyria, Ashurbanipal had a lot of ambitious construction plans, especially in the capital of Nineveh. During his time, some scholars believe that Nineveh became the largest city in the world, with a population of approximately 120,000 people. His grandfather, Sennacherib, had built a massive, opulent palace in the capital, which became known as the Palace Without Rival due to its grandeur. Not to be outdone, Ashurbanipal constructed his own palace, but also new temples to the gods, as well as city walls and gates, which were adorned with reliefs that, even to this day, constitute some of the most detailed and well-preserved examples of Assyrian art. Many of the reliefs show Ashurbanipal engaged in lion hunting, which was not only considered the sport of kings, but also a symbol of a ruler's ability to protect his people from Assyria's enemies. But the walls and the temples all paled in comparison with the king's most ambitious project, the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal. This may have been the first great library in the world, older than the more famous Library of Alexandria. Ashurbanipal possessed a thirst for knowledge, almost like an obsession, the same way other kings would crave jewels, gold, and other treasures. All the cities in his empire were ordered to bring him copies of their most important texts and tributes, and he sometimes even conquered new settlements just to get his hands on their libraries. His reasoning was thus: I, Ashurbanipal, king of the universe, on whom the gods have bestowed intelligence, I have placed these tablets for the future in the library of Nineveh, for my life and for the well-being of my soul, to sustain the foundations of my royal name. Soon after Ashurbanipal's death, the library was destroyed in a fire, but this turned out to be a real boon for archaeology. Most of the text was written on clay tablets, and they didn't burn in the fire. They were actually hardened and then got buried in the rubble. They were rediscovered during the mid-19th century, and since then over 30,000 tablets and fragments have been recovered, becoming one of the greatest troves of information about the ancient world. Construction projects and scholarly pursuits aside, Ashurbanipal was still a warmonger at heart, and he remained involved in one military conflict or another for most of his reign. Again, going by the Rassam cylinder, after his 2 campaigns in Egypt, Ashurbanipal fought some of the other smaller kingdoms that either tried to rebel or provided aid to his enemies. This included Tyre and Arwad, 2 Phoenician states, and the Neo-Hittite kingdoms called Tabal and Hilaku. He then sent aid to King Gyges of Lydia in his fight against the Cimmerians, and then invaded the land of the Manneans. However, the biggest conflict at this time was his war with the Elamites. Elam was a civilization that settled north of the Persian Gulf next to Sumer, occupying the western part of modern-day Iran. It remains, to this day, a preeminent yet mysterious culture of the ancient world. Preeminent because it was around for over 2,600 years, mysterious because almost everything we know about them comes from second-hand sources like the Akkadians, Sumerians, Babylonians, Egyptians, and of course the Assyrians. The Elamite language seems to have developed in isolation from its neighbors and is yet to be fully deciphered. One thing we do know is that Elam entered into direct conflict with Assyria in the late 8th century BC during the reign of Sargon II. He was Ashurbanipal's great-grandfather. The two sides continued to fight during the reigns of Sennacherib and Esarhaddon, but Ashurbanipal decided that he would end the war once and for all by annihilating the Elamite civilization. This was a drawn-out affair that occurred over 2 different campaigns, but once again, we can let Ashurbanipal himself tell us what happens. Like a terrible hurricane, I overwhelmed Elam in its entirety. I cut off the head of Tumen, their king. Countless of their warriors I slew. With their corpses I filled the plain about Susa. Their blood I let run down the Ulai. Its water I dyed red like wool. Although victorious, Ashurbanipal had to end his first campaign against Elam in a hurry because he received word that an alliance of Medes, Cimmerians, and Persians took advantage of his departure and launched a surprise attack on Nineveh. Therefore, Ashurbanipal returned to his capital, and with the help of his allies, the Scythians, he managed to repel the invaders. In Elam, he installed a new king before leaving, but it didn't take long for the Elamites to rebel against him. Therefore, in 647 BC, Ashurbanipal marched on Elam again. This time, he enacted widespread destruction, including razing the capital of Susa to the ground. Susa, the great holy city, abode of their gods, seat of their mysteries, I conquered. I entered its palaces, I opened their treasuries where silver and gold, goods and wealth were amassed. I destroyed the ziggurat of Susa, I smashed its shining copper horns. I reduced the temples of Elam to naught, their gods and goddesses I scattered to the wind. The tombs of their ancient and recent kings I devastated, I exposed to the sun, and I carried away their bones towards the land of Ashur. I devastated the provinces of Elam, and on their lands I sowed salt. Anyone of royal Elamite blood was made a slave. Most of the population was relocated and the cities and fields were left empty. Ashurbanipal thought that if he turned Elam into a wasteland, it would no longer be a threat. However, because fate can have a cruel sense of humor, the exact opposite happened. The Persians took over that territory and slowly began rebuilding it, while also gaining an important foothold in the region. Just a few decades after Elam's destruction, Assyria would fall as well. That's still in the future, though. For now, Ashurbanipal had another problem to contend with, one that many regarded as inevitable: his brother Shamash-shum-ukin. To nobody's surprise, he was never happy that his father named his younger brother as heir to his empire, while he received the inferior, mostly ceremonial title King of Babylon. For 16 years, he bided his time until he decided to strike. In 652 BC, the civil war erupted, although it seems that Shamash-shum-ukin's goal was to achieve independence for Babylon and become its true king, rather than an attempt to usurp the throne of the whole empire. According to some inscriptions, he had been plotting against his brother for years and had conspired with Elam against Ashurbanipal. They weren't the only ones either, as once the war started, Shamash-shum-ukin found plenty of other allies willing to fight on his side to gain independence for their kingdoms. This included the Arameans, the Chaldeans, and the kingdoms of Gutium and Amuru. Even so, it seems like the strength of this coalition was no match for Assyria, although, as they say, history is written by the victors, and in this case we only have Ashurbanipal's inscriptions to use as a source. Unsurprisingly, he is presented as being nigh indestructible thanks to the protection of Assur and Ishtar. I trod them underfoot to their farthest border. The yoke of Assur, which they had cast off, I placed upon them. Revenues, dues, and first fruits for the gods of Assyria I imposed upon them. My royal tribute and tax, yearly without ceasing, I laid upon them. It seems that most rebelling kingdoms got off pretty easy, especially since Ashurbanipal had a reputation of being exceedingly cruel to his enemies. However, that was not also the case for Babylon. The Assyrian king mounted a siege on the city that lasted over 2 years, driving the population into starvation, with one inscription mentioning that the Babylonians had to resort to cannibalism by eating the flesh of their sons and daughters to stay alive. When the city finally fell in 648 BC, Shamash-shum-ukin committed suicide by fire. As for the rest of the sinners, as Ashurbanipal called them, this was their fate. As for those men and their vulgar mouths who uttered vulgarity against Assur, my god, and plotted evil against me, I slit their mouths and brought them low, the rest of the people alive, by the Colossi, between which had cut down Sennacherib, the father of the father who begot me. At that time, I cut down those people there as an offering to his shade. Their dismembered bodies I fed to the dogs, swine, wolves, and eagles, to the birds of heaven and the fish of the deep. Ashurbanipal's final military campaign that we know of took place in the Arabian Peninsula against the various kingdoms that were situated there. He first took up the sword against a king named Uait, who is known only from this inscription. He was a former vassal who allied himself with Shamash-shum-ukin during the failed rebellion. According to the Rassam Cylinder, Ashurbanipal defeated Uait in battle, but he did not kill him, as he had a more humiliating punishment in mind for him. Instead, he placed the former king in a kennel alongside dogs and jackals so he would guard one of the gates into Nineveh. Afterwards, Ashurbanipal fought Amul-Ladi, king of the Kudarites, after the latter invaded a kingdom that was under Assyrian protection. Again, Ashurbanipal was triumphant and he stuck his enemy in a dog kennel. His final foes were two brothers, Aimu and Abiye, who were the sons of a king who also rebelled alongside the Babylonians. They too were defeated and taken prisoner, and it seems that Abiye died of thirst on his way to Nineveh, while Aimu was flayed alive in the Assyrian capital. Ashurbanipal also conquered the cities of Ushu and Akka, massacring its people and capturing its treasures for refusing to pay tribute to him. Now we arrive at the mysterious end of his reign, which is full of guesswork and debatable ideas due to a lack of sources. Sometime around 630 BC, Ashurbanipal fell ill and traveled to the city of Haran in modern-day Turkey. At that point, he disappears from the historical record, so he was either deposed or, most likely, he died there of some unknown illness. His son, Ashur-etil-Lani, became the new king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, but he lacked the strong will, ruthlessness, and determination of his father, and all of Assyria's vassals knew this, and many revolts occurred in the years that followed. The Scythians, the Medes, the Babylonians emerged as the greatest threat to Assyria as they banded together to bring down the once mighty war machine that had subjugated them all. The external strife might also have been compounded by a civil war between Ashur-etil-Lani and his brother Sin-shar-ishkun, who may have wanted the Assyrian throne for himself. We know that the first sibling only ruled for a few years before being succeeded by Sin-shar-ishkun, but we have no idea if Ashur-etil-Lani died or was usurped. His brother had a longer reign of approximately 15 years, but it mainly consisted of Sin-shar-ishkun desperately trying to hold on to his crumbling empire. Ultimately, he failed, and the once mighty capital of Nineveh fell in 612 BC, thus marking the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the start of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.